Chapter 6. Is there a case for Christ outside the Bible? It's 11:35 p.m. when you pull your car into the driveway. As you open the car door, a blinding light shines full in your face and a voice says, "Hold it right there. We've got some questions to ask you." After a brief recitation of your rights, a uniformed officer informs you that a driver your age in a vehicle of the same make as yours is wanted for questioning in connection with the series of crimes committed over the past 4 hours. You are invited to share anything that might persuade the officer that you are not the driver. Quickly you explain that you spent the evening in a law-abiding fashion. You picked up some friends and went to McDonald's, where you noticed that the Happy Meal toy was a promotion for the latest animated film. Ordered a Happy Meal. You had Value Meal number 3, supersized, and you had to finish the fries in the car in order to make it to the 8:15 showing of the new James Bond movie. One of your friends must have stepped in some gum on the theater floor because when you got back in the car, he noticed that it was all over the floor mat. So you spent a little time in the parking lot scraping the floor mat with leftover napkins from McDonald's before going to Baker Square for a piece of pie, cherry rhubarb, then dropping your friends off and coming straight home. As you finish your story, the officer who was scribbling notes says to her partner, "I'll call the theater and see what time the James Bond movie was showing tonight." The other officer flashes a warrant and tells you that he's going to take a look, very closely, inside your car. Now suppose the floor mats show no more than the usual amount of grime, and the officer finds no evidence of half-eaten French fries wedged between the seats. Does that mean that your story is all lies and you're headed for a certain conviction? Of course not, although it probably won't help your case. On the other hand, suppose the routine investigation reveals that the McDonald's you mentioned is in fact giving away the toy you described in its Happy Meals. The theater did show the Bond film at 8:15. Baker Square is currently serving cherry rhubarb pie, and to top it off, you have an almost empty, supersized carton of McDonald's fries in your car and a scrap of napkin stuck to the gum on the passenger's floor mat. Are you home free? Not necessarily, but your credibility is certainly higher. Corroborating evidence. What about the credibility of the Bible? We've talked about the evidence within the Bible for the case for Christ, see chapter 5, but what about the evidence outside the Bible? If Christ is for real and the Bible is true, I shouldn't have to take just the Bible's words on it. I ought to be able to find some corroborating evidence for the claim that Jesus is God. What I found is a lot like the French fry carton in your back seat. It doesn't settle anything one way or another. If you take it as absolute proof of the validity of the Bible and Christ's claims, then you're doing a sloppy job of investigating. On the other hand, if you write it off as irrelevant, then you're being more closed-minded than you'd probably like to admit. My challenge to myself was to check out the evidence in a fair-minded way. My challenge to you is the same. Beyond the biblical biographies. Did Jesus really live, or is he a fictional character found only in the Bible? If you've never read the Bible or any Christian writings, you could learn the following about Jesus from an ancient Jewish work called the Talmud, from an ancient historical writers such as Josephus, Tacitus, and Pliny the Younger. You've got to wonder what his parents were thinking when they named him. Jesus was a Jewish teacher. Many people believed he performed healings and other miracles. Some people believed he was the long-awaited Messiah. He was rejected by the Jewish leaders. He was crucified under the authority of Pontius Pilate in the reign of Tiberius. Despite this shameful death, his followers, who believed that he was still alive, spread beyond Palestine so that there were large numbers of them in Rome by AD 64. All kinds of people from the cities and the countryside, men and women, slave and free, worshipped him as God. Digging for details. Maybe you find the thought of a police officer digging through the trash in your car to find French fry cartons and pre-chewed bubblegum a little disgusting. But in essence, that's what archaeologists do, only with older piles of junk. Archaeology can do 3 things with respects to the Bible. It can uncover evidence that contradicts the Bible. For example, John 5:2 describes the Pool of Bethesda as having 5 covered porches. Suppose that archaeologists dig under a pool at that site that clearly only has 3 porches. That evidence would contradict what the Bible says and cast doubt on the accuracy of the New Testament. Actually, however, An excavation uncovered a pool with 5 covered porches at that site. Scholars have concluded that no archaeological evidence found to date flat out contradicts the Bible. Archaeology can uncover no evidence relating to the Bible one way or the other. Remember Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark? Like him, lots of people have looked for the remains of the Ark of the Covenant described in the Old Testament. Unlike the movie version, however, no one has yet found it. Does that mean that the Ark never existed? Not any more than the absence of McDonald's trash in your car means that you never ate McDonald's. You really can't draw a scientifically valid conclusion one way or the other from the absence of archaeological evidence. Archaeology can uncover evidence that confirms what the Bible says. Since I didn't find any evidence in the first category, contradicting the Bible, and you can't base a lot of conclusions on the second category, this third category is the one I spent some time checking out. Archaeology, like most sciences, involves drawing conclusions from the evidence. You know as well as I do that 2 different people can draw 2 different conclusions from the same evidence. Think, for example, about the lowest grade on your last report card. Your conclusion might be that you are not gifted in that subject, and so you should focus your energies elsewhere. Your parents' conclusions, on the other hand, might be that you should spend much more time on that subject. If archaeology shows that the New Testament writers were accurate in reporting historical and geographical details, does this increase your confidence that they would be similarly careful in recording events about Jesus? Why or why not? I wouldn't have been surprised to discover that archaeologists who were Christians interpreted the evidence as confirming biblical accounts, while archaeologists who were atheists or agnostics would be more skeptical. That's why I was especially fascinated by the story of Sir William Ramsay of Oxford University in England, one of history's greatest archaeologists. He was an atheist. He spent 25 years doing archaeological digs to try to disprove the book of Acts, which was written by the historian Luke, who also wrote the Gospel of Luke. See the box, An Archaeologist Looks at Luke. Instead of discrediting Luke's account, Ramsay's discoveries kept supporting it. Finally, he concluded that Luke was one of the most accurate historians who had ever written. Influenced by the archaeological evidence, Ramsay became a Christian. Notice that I said influenced by the evidence, not convinced. I didn't become a Christian because of archaeology, and I wouldn't recommend that anyone else base a faith completely on archaeology either. Archaeological evidence doesn't prove that Jesus is God. What it does do, however, is provide corroborative evidence that the writings about Jesus are trustworthy accounts. Contemporary corroboration. At the time that I was investigating the case for Christ, I was a newspaper reporter, not an archaeologist or historian. I know the importance of background research, so I was willing to take an interest in ancient sources, but my day-to-day focus was on the here and now. I moved in an article where yesterday's news didn't just make the grade. So I wondered what kind of contemporary evidence I might find to back up or discredit Christ's claims. An Archaeologist Looks at Luke. Several statements in Luke's writings in the Gospel of Luke and Book of Acts seem to be inaccurate, and that raised doubts about the rest of what Luke wrote. After all, if he couldn't get the basic facts right, how can you trust his other statements about more important matters? Then archaeological evidence began coming to light that showed that Luke was in fact correct, at least in those things that archaeologists could check out. Here are a few examples. In Luke chapter 3 verse 1, Luke refers to Lysanias as tetrarch. That's a kind of regional governing official of Abilene in about AD 27. For years, scholars pointed to this as evidence that Luke didn't know what he was talking about, because everybody knew that Lysanias was not a tetrarch, but rather the ruler of Chalcis, half a century earlier. Then archaeologists found an inscription from AD 14 to 37, naming Lysanias as tetrarch of Abila, near Damascus, just as Luke had written. It turns out there had been 2 government officials named Lysanias. Luke was right after all. Another example is Luke's reference in Acts chapter 17 verse 6 to Politarchs. If you look it up in the New International Version or other modern translations, you'll see it translated as city officials. For a long time, people thought Luke was mistaken because no evidence of the term Politarchs had been found in ancient Roman documents. Then archaeologists found a 1st century arch at the same time period which Luke was writing, with an inscription that begins in the time of the Politarchs. If you ever get to the British Museum in London, you can see that arch for yourself. Since then, archaeologists have found more than 35 inscriptions that mention Politarchs, showing that Luke was precisely accurate when he used that term. One prominent archaeologist carefully examined Luke's references to 32 countries, 54 cities, and 9 islands, and didn't find a single mistake. Then I met Ron. I was a Tribune reporter covering the Criminal Courts Building, a squat, gloomy facility next to the Cook County Jail in Chicago's West Side. Day after day, I watched a steady stream of defendants, most of them clearly guilty, desperately trying to exploit every loophole to avoid the punishment they deserved. Everybody was looking to cut a deal, to hoodwink the jury, to fool the judge, or to beat the rap. Anything but take responsibility for what they had done. Everybody except Ron. He turned everything upside down. The Book of Mormon. If you find yourself wondering whether archaeology can be used to substantiate the claims of just about any religious belief, you're not alone. I had the same suspicion. I wrote to the Smithsonian Institute and asked whether they had any evidence supporting the claims of Mormonism and the Book of Mormon. They told me in unequivocal terms that archaeologists see no direct connection between the archaeology of the New World and the subject matter of the book. As one expert wrote in a book on the topic, no one has uncovered any of the cities mentioned in the Book of Mormon. No one has uncovered any artifacts related to the Book of Mormon. No one has found any inscriptions confirming the Book of Mormon. No one has identified any person, place, nation, or name mentioned in the Book of Mormon. Starting young. When he was 8 years old, Ron threw a hammer at somebody's head and ended up in juvenile court. That was his first of many encounters with the law. Later, he dropped out of school, got mixed up with drugs, and rose to second in command of the Bel Airs, a vicious street gang that terrorized parts of Chicago. He got into big-time trouble when he was 21. A rival gang called the Palmer Street Gaylords brutally assaulted one of Ron's friends, and Ron vowed revenge. He borrowed a gun and went hunting for Bob, who had led the Gaylord attack. Attempted murder. It didn't take long for Ron to track down half a dozen Gaylords as they were leaving a bar. Although Bob wasn't among them, his brother Gary was. A plot quickly formed in Ron's mind. He decided to murder Gary, and then Bob showed up at his funeral. Ron would ambush him too. That way, he'd kill 2 Gaylords. So Ron jumped out of his hiding, thrusting the gun into Gary's chest, shouting, "Bel Airs!" and pulled the trigger. Click. The gun misfired. Now Ron was standing in front of 6 very angry Gaylords. As they began to come after him, Ron pointed the gun in the air and pulled the trigger again. This time, it went off, sending the Gaylords scattering. Ron started chasing Gary down the sidewalk, shooting at him as they ran. Finally, one of the bullets found its mark, tearing into Gary's back and lodging next to his liver. Gary collapsed face first on the pavement. Ron came up to him and flipped him over. "Don't shoot me, man," Gary pleaded. "Don't shoot me again, don't kill me." But without an ounce of compassion or a moment of hesitation, Ron shoved the gun in Gary's face and pulled the trigger. Click. This time, the gun was empty. On the run. A siren wailed in the distance. Ron escaped the police, but this promptly issued a warrant for his arrest on a charge of attempted murder. With Ron's extensive criminal record, a conviction would undoubtedly mean 20 years in the penitentiary. Ron couldn't stomach that. He and his girlfriend fled to Canada, then migrated west and ended up in Portland, Oregon, where Ron got his first legitimate job, working in a metal shop. His co-workers were Christians, and through their influence, Ron eventually became a Christian too. With that, his values and character began to change. His girlfriend became a Christian, and they got married. They had a little girl named Olivia. Ron became a model employee, an active church participant, and a well-respected member of the community, taking responsibility. But something kept gnawing at him. Even though he had been reconciled with God, he hadn't been reconciled with society. There was still a warrant out for his arrest. true. The police had stopped looking for him, and he probably could have spent the rest of his life in Oregon without getting caught. Still, he felt the only honest thing to do would be to give himself up and face the possibility of 20 years in prison away from his family. Otherwise, he said, he'd be living a lie. And as a Christian, he decided that simply wasn't an option. Ancient sources say that early Christians clung to their beliefs rather than deny them, even under torture. Ron acted on his belief even though he risked 20 years in prison. Why do you think these people had such strong-held convictions? I was there when Ron appeared in criminal court. Amazingly, unlike the other defendants who were trying to wiggle off the hook, Ron looked into the judge's eyes and basically said, "I'm guilty. I did it. I'm responsible. If I need to go to prison, that's okay. But I've become a Christian, and the right thing to do is to admit what I've done and ask for forgiveness. What I did was wrong, plain and simple, and I'm sorry. I really am." I was blown away. When somebody takes a costly step like that, you know it must be prompted by a faith that has radically transformed him or her from deep inside. And that attracted me. Why? Because we are living in wishy-washy times when the national motto might as well be, take the easy way out. So when someone says, I'm going to do something not because it's convenient or easy, but because it's right, that's a person I can respect. When you look around these days, you don't see many heroes. But in an odd kind of way, Ron became a hero to me. Radically changed. I was so intrigued by what Ron did that I asked him about it. When he told me how Jesus changed him from a street gang leader into a Christ follower, he had complete attention. And he had a special kind of credibility. Both his example and his words made a lasting impression on me, and on the judge too, by the way. He let Ron go free because of the incredible change in Ron's life. Today, Ron is using his freedom to serve young people in a public housing project. I had been asking whether there was any evidence outside the Bible that Christ was real and that the Christian faith meant something. Ron's changed life sure looked like that kind of evidence. But one major question remains for anyone taking seriously the case for Christ. Can a dead man really come back to life? Jesus and slavery. One of the ugliest blots on the pages of history is the practice of slavery. Most North Americans, when you mention slavery, think of the enslavement of thousands of African Americans, some of whom imported to America as if they were nothing more than cargo, others of whom were born into captivity with little or no hope of ever being free. But slavery didn't begin on the plantations of North America. The history of slavery goes way back to well before the time of Jesus. If Jesus is God, and God is ethically perfect, why didn't Jesus put an end to slavery once and for all when he lived in Palestine some 2,000 years ago? As far as we know, Jesus never specifically attacked slavery. Why didn't he stand up and shout, slavery is wrong? When I challenged Donald Carlson, a Christian theologian, with this issue, he made the following points. First, when we think of slavery today, we think of one race oppressing another race. In Jesus' time, slavery wasn't an issue of race or class. Some people became slaves during war. Others sold themselves into slavery as a way to pay off debts. Slavery, at least among people who respected God, wasn't meant to be lifelong either. The Bible taught that every 7 years, all slaves should be set free. Slaves in Jesus' day weren't necessarily abused. Some were the equivalent of PhDs with responsibility for teaching the family. That doesn't mean that slavery was a good thing, but it does mean that it wasn't the destructive racial issue it has been in the US. Second, you have to keep your eye on Jesus' mission. His primary goal was not to overturn the Roman economic system, which included slavery. After all, one oppressive social system can easily be replaced by another that's even worse. Jesus came to free men and women from their sins, so that was the focus of his message. But what that message does is transform people from the inside so that they begin to love God and to value other people too. And that has an impact on what they think of slavery. For example, when the Apostle Paul wrote to a Christian named Philemon about Philemon's slave, Onesimus, Paul didn't order Philemon to free his slave. What he did was tell Philemon to treat Onesimus just as he would treat Paul or his own brother. You can read that letter in the New Testament. It's simply called Philemon. And in England and the US, it was transformed Christians who successfully campaigned for slavery to be abolished. Carson speaks as a Christian, so you wouldn't expect him to criticize Jesus for not directly speaking out against slavery. Whether you find his arguments convincing is something you'll have to decide. What he said about change coming from the inside instead of being forced on people from the outside made sense to me because of my own experience. I know a guy who was so racist that he disliked anyone who wasn't white. He was particularly prejudiced against African Americans. The racial slurs he used made me cringe when I was around him, but nothing I said even made a dent in his racism. Then he became a follower of Jesus. I didn't notice a big difference at first, but gradually the way he talked about people of different races began to change. I noticed other signs that his attitudes were changing too. If you met him today, you'd have to say that he genuinely accepts people of any race or ethnic background. Laws against racial profiling didn't change him. Diversity training didn't change him. The disapproval of other people didn't change him. His change came from the inside out, when he realized that the God he follows, loves people of all races and calls him to do the same.